I'm working late, don't wait up. The text from my husband appeared on my screen at the exact moment I looked through the open church doors. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then the groom turned slightly, and I saw Ethan. My Ethan. Standing at the altar, waiting for a bride. A bride who wasn't me. The organ music swelled through the church. Guests smiled. Someone laughed softly. Then the bride stepped into view. My stomach dropped. "Claire," I whispered. My best friend. 15 years of friendship. The woman who had held my hand when I got married. The woman who told me just last week, "Ethan's under a lot of pressure. Don't take the late nights personally." She was wearing white, walking toward my husband, while he texted me that he was working late. I stared at my phone, then back at the altar, then at the rows of guests. And that somehow hurt even more, because I recognized them. Friends, coworkers, people who had attended my wedding, people who smiled at me every time they saw me. How many of them knew? How long had I been the only person left in the dark? My phone trembled in my hand. Without thinking, I opened Ethan's message. My thumbs moved calmly, far calmer than I felt. I typed, "Enjoy your night, honey." Then I hit send. Across the church, Ethan's phone vibrated. I watched him glance down, watched him read the message, watched him slip the phone back into his pocket, and continue preparing to marry my best friend. As if nothing was wrong. As if I didn't exist. As if I was already erased from my own life. I didn't storm inside. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. Instead, I sat there until the ceremony began. Then I quietly started my car and drove away. The entire drive home, one thought repeated in my head. Not why. Not how. But how much? How much had they lied? How much had they hidden? How much of my life had been fake? Because this betrayal hadn't appeared out of nowhere. Pieces of it had been sitting in front of me for months. Maybe longer. The moment I walked into the house, I didn't cry. I went straight to my office, pulled open a filing cabinet, and started collecting documents. Bank records, statements, old emails, schedules, receipts, anything that suddenly seemed important. The more papers I gathered, the more memories started fitting together. Claire defending Ethan every time I questioned his late nights. Ethan dismissing every concern. Friends acting strangely around me. Invitations that had quietly stopped arriving. At the time, I had explained everything away. Now I wasn't so sure. An hour later, I opened an old folder I hadn't touched in months. A single document slid out. I froze. The date at the top was nearly a year old. A full year. Long before I ever suspected anything. Long before Ethan started claiming he was always working late. Long before Claire began acting like the perfect supportive friend. I stared at the page, then looked back at the date again. My pulse started pounding. Because if this document meant what I thought it meant, then the wedding I had just witnessed wasn't something they had rushed into. It had been planned. Carefully. Patiently. For far longer than I ever imagined. I lowered myself into my chair and whispered one question into the empty room. How long have they really been planning this? 6 months earlier, if someone had told me my husband and my best friend were building a life together behind my back, I would have laughed. Not because Ethan and Claire weren't close. Because they were. Too close looking back. At the time, though, they were simply the two people I trusted most. The three of us spent weekends together. Dinner together. Holidays together. Claire joked that she was our unofficial third wheel. "Someone has to keep you two organized," she would say. Ethan would laugh. I would laugh. And neither of them ever looked uncomfortable. That was what made everything so easy to miss. One evening, Ethan arrived home, nearly 2 hours late. Again. "Sorry," he said, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Big project issue." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. "Claire, don't be hard on him. He's been stressed lately." I frowned. I hadn't even told her Ethan was late. When I mentioned it the next day, she smiled. "Oh, he texted me earlier. He seemed exhausted." At the time, it sounded harmless. Now it felt different. The late nights became normal. Every explanation came ready-made. Every concern I raised already had an answer. And somehow, Claire always delivered it first. One Friday, I surprised Ethan with reservations at his favorite restaurant. I was excited. We hadn't spent time alone in weeks. When I called him, he sighed. "I can't make it." Again. "Work emergency." I hung up disappointed. 10 minutes later, Claire called. "Don't take it personally." I stared at the phone. "How do you know about dinner?" Silence. Only for a second. Then she laughed. "Oh, Ethan mentioned it earlier. Something about the exchange bothered me." But I pushed the feeling away. That was what I always did. Whenever evidence appeared, I found a way to explain it. Whenever a question surfaced, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Weeks passed. Then I noticed Ethan guarding his phone. He never used to. Now he carried it everywhere. Bathroom. Garage. Even the kitchen. One night, his screen lit up while he was showering. I didn't touch it, but I saw the name. Claire. When he came back, he immediately grabbed the phone. Too quickly. Like he was checking whether I'd seen something. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. His answer came too fast. A few days later, Claire stopped by for coffee. I finally admitted what had been bothering me. "I feel like Ethan's pulling away." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're imagining the worst." "Maybe." "He loves you, Nora." "You think so?" "Of course." She smiled warmly. Comfortingly. Exactly like a best friend should. Yet somehow I left that conversation feeling worse. Not better. A month later, we attended a mutual friend's birthday party. Nothing dramatic happened. At least not at first. People mingled. Music played. Conversations overlapped. Then I looked across the room. Ethan was talking to Claire. She said something. He smiled. Not unusual. Then their eyes locked. For barely a second. A tiny moment. Easy to miss. But there was something in it. Something private. Something practiced. The second they noticed me looking, both turned away. Back to normal. Back to acting. I spent the drive home staring out the window. For the first time, I stopped dismissing the feeling in my gut. Instead, I started paying attention. I reviewed old calendars. Old texts. Canceled plans. Work nights. Excuses. Patterns emerged. Not proof, but patterns. Enough to make me watch more carefully. Then one night everything changed. I was driving home from a late meeting when I passed a downtown office building. The same building Ethan claimed housed his company's after-hours project team. The same building where he supposedly spent countless late nights. A woman walked out through the front entrance. I immediately recognized her. Claire. I checked the dashboard clock. 12:17 a.m. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Because Claire didn't work there. And according to Ethan, neither of them should have been anywhere near that building together. Then I saw her glance back toward the entrance, as if someone inside was watching her leave. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't keep explaining things away anymore. Claire got into her car and pulled away from the curb. For a moment, I almost followed her. Almost. Instead, I stayed parked across the street, staring at the office building Ethan claimed was keeping him busy night after night. The building lights were still on. My husband was supposedly inside. But for the first time, I wasn't interested in confronting anyone. I wanted answers. Real answers. Because if I confronted them too early, they'd just lie again. And I was tired of being lied to. The next few weeks changed everything. Not because I found proof. Because people started behaving differently around me. At first, it was subtle. A couple I usually met for brunch suddenly became unavailable. A group dinner invitation never arrived. A friend canceled plans at the last minute. Then another. Then another. One afternoon, I walked into a coffee shop and spotted 3 mutual friends sitting together. The second they saw me, the conversation stopped. Completely. The silence hit harder than any argument. "Hey," I said. "Hi, Nora." Their smiles looked forced. Awkward. Like people caught discussing something they shouldn't. I sat down briefly. Tried making normal conversation. Nobody seemed relaxed. Nobody met my eyes for very long. When I left, I knew something was wrong. The problem was I still didn't know what. A few days later, Ethan and I attended a dinner party hosted by one of his coworkers. The evening started normally. Then I overheard something that made my blood run cold. Honestly, they've handled the separation pretty maturely. I froze. The comment came from across the room. Someone else nodded. Yeah, most couples would make things messier. Separation. What separation? I was still married. Very much married. I glanced toward Ethan. He was talking with another group, completely relaxed. As if nothing unusual had just been said. As if his entire life wasn't built on a lie. I quietly approached the conversation. Sorry, I said. What separation? The room went silent. A woman nearly dropped her drink. Another person looked away. Nobody answered immediately. Separation, I repeated. Where did you hear that? An uncomfortable pause followed. Finally, someone muttered, I thought everybody knew. Knew what? The group exchanged nervous looks. Then one man cleared his throat. We were told you, and Ethan had basically gone your separate ways. I stared at him. Who told you that? Nobody wanted to answer. But they didn't need to. I already knew. The drive home was unbearable. Ethan talked about work. Traffic. Weekend plans. Normal things. I barely responded. Because while he chatted casually from the driver's seat, I kept hearing the same sentence. We were told you, and Ethan had basically gone your separate ways. Someone had been telling a story about my marriage. And I hadn't been invited into it. The next week, I met one of my oldest friends for lunch. Unlike everyone else, she looked genuinely uncomfortable from the moment she sat down. Nora, she said quietly. What? Can I ask something? Sure. She hesitated. Then finally said it. I thought you already knew about Claire and Ethan. The restaurant noise seemed to disappear. What do you mean? Her eyes widened. You really don't know. Know what? She leaned back slowly, as if realizing she'd made a mistake. Then she started explaining. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to change everything. Over the previous months, Ethan and Claire had attended events together. Parties. Networking functions. Weekend gatherings. Not openly announcing themselves as a couple, but close enough that people assumed they were. And nobody questioned it because they'd been told the same story. That my marriage was essentially over. That I was focused on my career. That Ethan had moved on. The most humiliating part wasn't the affair. It was realizing they hadn't been hiding from everyone. Only from me. The entire room seemed smaller. My chest tightened. How many people know? My friend looked down. Didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence said enough. Everything I thought was happening suddenly felt too small. This wasn't just cheating. This wasn't just secret meetings. They were replacing me. Socially. Publicly. Deliberately. And somehow, I was the last person to find out. My friend swallowed hard and stared at me. Then she asked a question that made my heart stop. Wait, you mean you honestly don't know about the wedding? The wedding? The words barely left my mouth. My friend immediately looked horrified. Like she wanted to grab them back. Nora, I'm sorry. What wedding? She pressed her lips together. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she shook her head. I thought you knew. Knew what? Another silence. Then finally, Claire and Ethan. The restaurant suddenly felt too bright. Too loud. Too crowded. Tell me exactly what you're talking about. My friend lowered her voice. There have been rumors for months. Rumors about what? A ceremony. I stared at her. A ceremony where? A church. My pulse started hammering. Are you saying they're getting married? I don't know the details, she said quickly. I just know people have been talking about some kind of wedding. I sat perfectly still. Because suddenly, dozens of moments snapped together. Like pieces of a puzzle, finally finding their place. The canceled trips. The disappearing weekends. The late-night meetings. The strange reactions from friends. The rumors of separation. The careful lies. For months, I had been looking at individual pieces. Now I could finally see the picture. And it was far worse than I imagined. The moment I got home, I started digging. Not emotionally. Methodically. I pulled bank statements. Credit card records. Shared account histories. Travel confirmations. Every document I could access. Hour after hour, I built timelines. And the timelines told stories. Stories Ethan never had. Payments connected to weekends he claimed to be working. Expenses that didn't match his explanations. Reservations. Purchases. Transfers. None of it independently proved everything. But together it painted a very clear picture. Then I found something else. A series of financial movements that made no sense. Money shifting between accounts. Amounts that were small enough to avoid attention, but frequent enough to matter. I printed everything. Every statement. Every record. Every discrepancy. By sunrise, my dining room table looked like an investigation board. Only now I wasn't wondering if Ethan was lying. I was trying to understand how much. The next day, I called an attorney. Then another. By the end of the week, I had legal guidance. Don't confront him yet, the attorney advised. Why? Because right now, he believes you know nothing. I nodded. That's your advantage. For the first time in months, I felt something shift. Control. Not complete control. But enough. Enough to stop reacting. Enough to start planning. Over the following days, financial records were preserved. Documentation was secured. Important assets were cataloged. Witnesses who had unknowingly seen pieces of Ethan and Claire's relationship were identified. Meanwhile, Ethan continued acting exactly the same. Every night, another message arrived. Working late. Long meeting. Don't wait up. The lies became almost ridiculous once I knew the truth. Yet he sent them anyway. Confident. Comfortable. Certain he was getting away with everything. Claire seemed equally confident. According to mutual friends, she had started discussing future plans. Trips. Events. A new chapter. Neither of them had any idea I was already preparing for mine. Then I received the information I had been waiting for. The church ceremony was scheduled for that weekend. Not months away. Not weeks away. Days. They were actually going through with it. And they believed I remained completely unaware. On the evening of the ceremony, I parked across the street from the church, hidden from view, watching. The guests arrived first. Then more guests, many of them familiar. People who had accepted the story Ethan and Claire created. People who believed I was already out of the picture. Then Ethan arrived. Relaxed. Smiling. Like a man beginning a new life. My phone buzzed. I looked down. A text from him. Working late, don't wait up. I almost laughed. Instead, I opened the message. Typed 4 words. Enjoy your night, honey. Then I pressed send. Across the church, his phone vibrated. I watched him glance down. Read it. And slip the phone away without concern. He still thought he was in control. He still thought the lie was working. Inside the church, the ceremony continued. I stayed long enough to see everything I needed to see. Then I quietly stood, returned to my car, and drove away before the reception began. The next morning, Ethan planned to continue pretending. He never got the chance, because before he could return home and tell another lie, there was a knock on a church office door, another at his workplace, and another where Claire happened to be. Documents were being delivered, and neither of them had any idea what was inside. Ethan didn't come home that night, at least not immediately. According to the timeline I later pieced together, he and Claire spent hours celebrating after the ceremony. They believed everything had gone exactly as planned. The affair had remained hidden. Their carefully crafted story had worked. And I was still the unsuspecting wife, waiting at home. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. The legal documents arrived exactly as scheduled. Not just to Ethan. Not just to Claire. To multiple people connected to the situation. The reactions were immediate. Confusion. Panic. Phone calls. Questions. By the time Ethan finally returned to our house, his confidence was gone. He walked through the front door and stopped. The house felt different. Because it was. Important documents were gone. Copies had been secured. Shared financial activity had already been reviewed under legal guidance. And most importantly, I wasn't sitting there waiting for explanations. I was finished listening to them. His phone started ringing before he could even process what was happening. Then again. And again. Claire. Friends. People asking questions. People demanding answers. The story they had spent months controlling was beginning to unravel. Vast. When Ethan finally reached me, his voice sounded nothing like the confident man I had watched in church. Nora, we need to talk. No, I said calmly. You need to explain. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then the excuses began. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We never wanted to hurt you. You don't understand the whole situation. The same phrases people use when they get caught. Not when they're honest. When they're caught. Claire tried next. She called repeatedly. Then sent messages. Then longer messages. Finally, she managed to speak with me. We never meant for this to be so painful. I looked at the screen. 15 years of friendship. Reduced to that sentence. Then why lie for so long? I asked. She had no answer. Because there wasn't one. As the legal process moved forward, the full truth became impossible for them to hide. Their relationship hadn't been recent. It hadn't started after some imaginary separation. It had been developing for far longer than either of them admitted. Worse, they hadn't simply hidden the relationship. They had built an entire narrative around it. A narrative where I was the problem. The absent wife. The career-obsessed spouse. The woman supposedly uninterested in her marriage. That story had been repeated often enough that many people accepted it without question. Until evidence started appearing. Messages. Timelines. Witness accounts. Financial records. The facts were far less flattering than the version Ethan and Claire had been telling. One by one, people began realizing they had been manipulated. Friends who once avoided me started reaching out. Some apologized directly. Others admitted they had believed what they were told. A few confessed they always suspected something wasn't right but didn't want to get involved. Meanwhile, Ethan and Claire faced the consequences of losing control of the narrative. The social support they counted on began disappearing. People who attended the church ceremony distanced themselves. Mutual friends stopped defending them. Conversations changed. Questions became harder to answer. And every new fact made their story weaker. The financial review created additional problems. Transactions that once seemed invisible suddenly received attention. Records were examined. Explanations were requested. The confidence both of them had displayed during the church ceremony slowly vanished. For months, they had operated from a position of power. They knew the truth while I didn't. They controlled information while I trusted them. They decided what everyone heard. Then everything reversed. Now people were questioning them. Now they were explaining themselves. Now they were the ones losing credibility. And I no longer needed their approval. That was the biggest change of all. Not the legal outcome. Not the social fallout. The freedom. The freedom that arrived when I stopped trying to understand people who had chosen deception. Months later, my life looked completely different. Quieter. Simpler. Healthier. The constant uncertainty was gone. So was the habit of checking whether someone's words matched their actions. Because the people who created that anxiety were no longer part of my life. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found a screenshot buried in an archive folder. A familiar text message. Working late, don't wait up. I stared at it for a moment. The message that once represented confusion, doubt, and betrayal now looked almost pathetic. A tiny lie hiding a massive deception. I smiled, then deleted it permanently. No hesitation. No sadness. No second thoughts. Just relief. The night I watched my husband marry my best friend, they thought they were starting a new life. What they didn't realize was that mine was finally beginning.